Hey everybody, Ted Forbes. Welcome back to The Art of Photography. In this video, we're going to look at the work of Tom Baril. And I think Tom, more than anyone else in the world of photography, has had the most influence on me personally. The first time I saw his work, I was really blown away and really drawn to the fact that Tom approaches photography not only as a photographer and as somebody who's making compositions and working in camera, but also in the craft that goes into his work and the printing techniques that he uses. And Tom was at the forefront of the revival in the late 90s that was going on with a lot of the popularity or resurgence of alternative process photography. And he was working in collodion, did this beautiful series of work at the Bethlehem Steel Mill in Pennsylvania. And he's worked in photogravure, and he does some amazing, outstanding stuff. And he's really inspirational to me from those two fronts. The simplicity with composition and this beauty of what he's capturing, mostly with still lifes or outdoor architectural types of things, but bringing that with this sense of craft into actually having this huge range of what he does with printmaking is just stunning, and that's what I want to look at today. So without further ado, we're going to go over and check out the first book that he did, which is just called Tom Baril, which was for a long time my holy grail book, and I finally found a copy of it a couple years ago, and it's still one of my favorites to this day. Tom was born in Connecticut, went to the School of Visual Arts in New York, and spent years as Robert Mapplethorpe's printer. And the two have a similarity in that they both shoot flowers as a subject quite often, but that's about where it ends. I think they fit really nicely together, but you know, Tom spent years printing for Mapplethorpe, and eventually, after Mapplethorpe passed away, went on and to have a career of his own as a photographer. So without further ado, let's go check out the work of Tom Baril. Before we get too far into this, I want to talk a little bit about this book for a minute. This is the first monograph of two that have been published on Baril's work, and this one was extremely rare. It was done in a limited run of 2,500 copies. It was extremely well made, and I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it reflects the kind of craftsmanship and quality that Tom has in his own work, and I think it's a really special book in that regard. This was published by 4AD, which was also a record label, as most people know. It's still around. They don't do books anymore. I think they did two. One of the founders of 4AD was a huge photography fan, and for whatever reason he really loved Tom Baril, and this was one of the first books they did. It was extremely expensive to make, and anyway, it's probably why 4AD aren't in the book publishing business anymore. I finally found my copy after looking for this for several years at an art gallery here in Dallas, and this was a display copy that they would use to sell prints to prospective buyers. This particular copy had a bent front cover, and considering I only had to pay about $40 for it, not a big deal for me. You can see that the book is cloth bound, which is really nice, and then the front cover has an embossed rectangle in the middle that is inlaid with a reproduction of one of Tom's prints. And I want to talk about the process, and we'll get specific when we get into images in here. But you're not going to see any of the collodion work. Really what this book focuses on is a series of work that Tom did using Polaroid Type 55 film. And for those of you who are not familiar with Type 55, it was one of the more beautiful and interesting films that Polaroid made, and it is no longer in production. You can still find it used, but considering that you can't refrigerate or freeze Polaroid film and make it last like you can with standard film, it's a crapshoot. So for all intents and purposes, this is a technique that's for the most part extinct right now, which is too bad. The way Polaroid Type 55 worked, it was rated at an ISO of 55, so it was very low speed, and it came in this pack, and I want to talk about it because you're going to see some of these in the images, and this is how you can tell it's Polaroid Type 55. It came in a pack. You had a special holder that went in the back of the large format camera, and this is about the size of the negative too, so it was large format, 4x5, and what you would do is you'd put the sleeve into the holder, and you'd pull the sleeve up, which would expose the film. You would take the picture, put the sleeve back down, and then this holder had a series of rollers that you would pin down, and then you rip it out. And what that would do is break the packet that held the chemicals, and it would coat the image. And you know, after a couple minutes, you would peel it apart, and then you could rinse and fix, and it was instant film. The interesting thing also about Polaroid Type 55 is it had a positive print and a negative inside that pack. So when you would peel it apart, it would develop both. The prints were okay, good to just check your exposure and stuff, but the negatives were absolutely gorgeous. And the tonality that this film was capable of, even at slow speeds, I mean, it was just really beautiful. I used to shoot a lot of Type 55. It was not cheap. And like I said, you can still find it on eBay and stuff. It's a little bit of a gamble, and it's going to be really expensive if you can find it now. I just don't think it's worth it anymore. I think it's just gone. It also had a frame in here, and you can usually see some artifacts from the frame, and then also sometimes the chemicals would bleed around where the print would stick to the negative, and it was a contact print is essentially what it made with instant film. So it has this kind of, it adds to the charm and the vibe of it, but you have these imperfections in the image around the frame borders, and that's usually how you can tell it's Type 55. And at the front here, absolutely beautiful picture with this soft focus of the smokestacks of this factory. And I want to get into this a little bit and share with you why this is so special to me. In the forward here, it explains a little bit of the process of how they did the book, and essentially what they did is they made what they call Tritone Negatives that were created from Tom's prints. Now, Tom's prints are usually toned with tea, just like, instant drinking tea. And he would make the print, actually soak it in tea for, maybe a minute or two or longer. I've done it before. And it adds this beautiful sepia toning to your print. And it's just interesting. It's done with an organic thing like tea. But anyway, the way they reproduce this is they made what they called Tritone Negatives. And so typically, when you're going to reproduce something, they would take the original print and they would make a Tritone Negative. So that meant a 3-color negative to make sure you got, more richness and more gradation in the tones and what have you. And then this was in turn printed on very high quality paper. And this book is just stunningly beautiful. You're probably not going to pick up on these nuances in the video here, but it is absolutely gorgeous. The paper is outstanding. And the prints look amazing. This is more of a handmade feel in some ways than, sure, there are a lot of well-printed books, but to go to this effort on it is extra special. So I want to get into some of the images now, and I'll start with the calla lilies here. And I've shown Tom's work on the show before, and you may have seen some of these images. But what I find interesting too is this is a pretty clean pull on the Polaroid 55 film. It doesn't have a lot of imperfections, but you do have the borders here, and I think it adds to making it a little more organic. What's interesting too is that Baril also used a technique of solarization, and when you start to, it has, Man Ray was really well known for this, and several other photographers, but you have these kind of hard contrast edges, and it almost looks like it's starting to be a negative. The tones become softer in the midsection as you go to the highlights, and this is achieved by exposing the negative to light as it's being developed. And I've never done it with Type 55, so I don't know exactly how he went out about it, but you can do this with any film. The speculation is it was invented in the darkroom when somebody accidentally turned on the light before the film was developed. And so there's techniques. It's actually really hard to control. It's a little bit random, but it has a beautiful effect once you get it going on right. And I think that a lot of these images are outstanding that show off a lot of that solarization technique. You can see it with the poppy flower here. And also you're going to see too, because flowers are, in these still lifes, are an important subject to Baril, that, I'll talk about it in a second when we get to that section, but the influence of Mapplethorpe, when I talked to Tom once, he told me that, it was strictly a business relationship and he liked Mapplethorpe's work, but he didn't feel that it influenced him at all. I would actually beg to differ a little bit. I think that between Karl Blossfeldt, who he does claim is an influence, and Mapplethorpe, and Baril sitting somewhere in the middle, I think his pictures have a place, and that may not have been a direct influence in the sense that he copies it or tries to look like Mapplethorpe, but I think knowing where Mapplethorpe was with the floral shots that he did, I think Baril has created a place in the middle, and certainly being very aware of that, being his printer. This is the same image from the cover, and again, you'll notice that the tones vary a little bit, and a lot of that is allowing parts of the process, whether it's the toning with tea, in some cases the solarization, there's a little bit of that random organic type thing that comes into image making that I think gives it a lot of character and a lot of soul. I think, in the modern day, we're so obsessed with recreating images, being able to print consistently, that we lose a little bit of that soul and that character. I've shown this image on the show before, but he did a whole bunch of images in New York, but a beautiful picture of the Chrysler building is taken from an empty office, across the way. Some beautiful shots that he did in New York. Of course, living up in the Northeast, you see I have stickers in here, sold out. That was from the printer. Anyway, another shot of the Chrysler building that's gorgeous. And I love the sky in there and the way it works. And Baril has a beautiful sense for composition. And I think what I like the most about his work is that he has a way using composition that starts to bring personality out in the subject that he's shooting, and I think a case in point would be these sunflowers. there's a whole series of these enormous sunflowers, and the way that it really takes up most of the frame, and the way too that between, you know, this one is the solarization is evident here, but it's very mild. You see it mainly on the petals on the bottom right hand side, but again you can kind of see the perforation seam and where the frame attached to the 55, and it really bringing the subject that's that simple, just the head of a sunflower, and letting it fill the composition like that, and take use of the solarization and the tones and a lot of the kind of the analog effects that are applied, I think is just outstanding. Also, like this one, and I've showed some of these sunflowers on the show before, but doing, you know, things that are unconventional, like shooting these flowers from behind. I think in some ways that Baril starts to bring in, this one that's wilting, they're almost like portraits because there is kind of a personality of the gesture in the flower that he's shooting that comes through and is evident. Here's one that's a little bit messier. You can see where where was it? These roses, you can see where the chemicals popped and kind of bled into the picture. And I love a lot of that. I think it just really adds, you know, kind of a nice throwback feel to it, to more of the 19th century techniques, but done with, you know, late 20th century techniques. These are great too, and we start to see pinholes in here, and these are some of my favorites, where, you know, Baril would do these, what he called tabletop pinhole images, and they were done on a very basic camera, and these pairs, it's almost like a group portrait of people or animals or something, and the way that he brings that personality through and that beautiful soft focus that the pinhole gives you, I think is just outstanding. And you don't see something like that, you know, tabletop photography done with a pinhole, and I think it's just very unusual, just a gorgeous look to the soft focus, and, you know, the subject matter, I think the way he approaches it, it's meditative in a sense that, you know, this is, I wouldn't consider to be minimalism, but it's minimalist type subjects, like a group of pears or flowers, or in this case some rolled paper, that you know, just playing with those compositions and working with those. He's done some work with some seashells, and of course these also bring back you know, to mind some of the work that people like Steichen were doing, or Edward Weston. There's a little bit of that influence here as well, but beautiful work. And then also there's a bit of an homage in here when you start getting into some of these types of things that Blossfeldt shot. And Carl Blossfeldt, I did a show on a long time ago, and I'll link it up in the show notes, and there certainly was that influence as well. Of course, Blossfeldt being a botanist and would use these for school. Another interesting series in here, and these are probably some of the more controversial end of Baril's work. This is a series called Aviva, which I assume is this woman's name, but these are a series of nudes that he did. And what I like about this, and what I find interesting about it, is that it relates to some of the organic subjects, like the flowers or fruits, or, you know, the tabletop photography. But these are done with, let's just say, a plus-sized woman. And the other thing that I find interesting about this is that, you know, when you look historically, not only in fine art but in commercial work, of figure studies and nudes, and that's not something we've ever talked about on the show before. You know, we have kind of this representation, particularly, well, I would say, you know, you see it the most with females, but you get it with men as well, where the body becomes objectified, and especially with commercial work and fashion, it becomes this, you know, idolized figure that, you know, for whatever reason sets this standard of what beauty is. And I love the fact that Baril has chosen something that is the opposite of that, and created, he calls these abstracts, but creates these studies out of it that are completely the opposite. I guess they do objectify in a sense, because at first glance here you don't realize that this is a human figure, but it's not the same objectification that we traditionally associate with nude photography. Anyway, there's a whole series of these in here, and I think they're beautiful. Another shot that's just a simple shot, but I love, we're gonna get into the seascapes that Baril did here. And this one is a butterfly on the beach, and it's just a simple pinhole image. When I talked to Tom the one time I had an opportunity to do that, I did ask him about some of these, and, you know, they bring to mind some of the seascapes that Sugimoto did, but they're much different. They're toned differently. Just the composition is very similar, but it's a very different feel to what Baril was doing with these. And, you know, he said that they're really easy to shoot. He did them with a pinhole, wanted really long exposures. So with a pinhole, you have a small aperture. This is not type 55 to my knowledge. This is kind of a break from what we've been talking about, but probably a low film speed. And then he said he also used an orange filter, and his exposures came out to be about 25 minutes. And he said that these were not exactly, I think the one I was referring to was this one. these were not abandoned beaches. He said they were actually people out here. But when your exposure is that long as people are moving and not sitting and walking through, he said people were walking along the beach, they're not going to show up in the exposure. But I love because you have this long exposure and the beautiful gradient in the sky there. And this becomes so simple. You know, when we talked about our composition series of episodes, and we talked about the use of line and shape, and these are just perfect studies for this, with this beautiful line and this small shape that comes in with the highlight off of the wave as it's coming in. You know, and as a 25-minute exposure, you're going to lose the details in things like water, any kind of cloud movement. This looks like it was done on a pretty clear day. Clouds move pretty slow, so they'll generally blur out in a composition like that. And he's got some beautiful stuff. And then, like, this one's a really nice study too, where you have, you know, a similar feel with the beach, a little bit of clouds over here, and a pole that breaks up the composition. Very experimental in some ways, but also very minimal. And the fact that these elements, because of the long exposure, are a little bit blurred out and softened in their feel, it becomes just kind of these shape studies or these almost abstracts. Anyway, this is a beautiful book. As I said, it was limited to about 2,500 copies. You could still find it if you look around. Of course, Amazon, stuff like that, you're going to find used copies and they're going to cost a fortune. But if you keep your eyes out, you could probably run across it. But I did want to share this book with you guys today because it's just one of my favorites. This was done with large format camera with obviously a strong depth of field. So everything from pinhole to straight up photography, different manipulations of Type 55, solarization techniques, range of subject matter, and the way he would incorporate personalities into very simple shapes and organic things like flowers and all. I think his work is just outstanding, and which is why he is one of my favorite photographers. I want to take a second and give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at audiblepodcast.com. If you're not familiar with Audible, they are the world's leading provider of audiobooks with over 150,000 titles across all types of literature, including fiction, nonfiction, and periodicals. If you go over to their website, you will see they have an amazing selection, and I'm going to show you how you can get your first book absolutely free. Now, I've been looking through here lately for some new stuff to read myself. This is an excellent way to pass time when you're at the gym or you're commuting, and one of the trends that you're seeing a lot of these days are kind of these inspirational entrepreneurial type books. And of course, we had the Walter Isaacson biography on Steve Jobs that came out about a year or two ago, and there's a new one that's come out called Becoming Steve Jobs: The Evolution of a Reckless Upstart into a Visionary Leader. Now, the Walter Isaacson's book was a pretty much straight up biography, and a lot of people felt it was a little bit shallow in some of the behind the scenes looks at, you know, what made Steve Jobs, and what made him so successful and what drove him. And this book kind of aims to do that by talking to family members, you know, the inside circle early on at Apple, Pixar, Disney, and this is supposed to be amazing. This is on my list. If you want to get this book absolutely free, I have a special URL for you. And if you go over to that URL, what you want to do is sign up for the service, and you have 30 days to decide if it's right for you or not. And if it's not, cancel your subscription. No hard feelings. The first book is yours to keep absolutely free. You pay nothing. So what you want to do is head over to audiblepodcast.com/AOP. That is audiblepodcast.com/AOP. That lets them know I sent you, and you're going to get that first book with your trial membership absolutely free. And I want to give another special shout out and thanks to the folks at Audible for once again sponsoring another episode of The Art of Photography. As I mentioned earlier, Tom Baril is probably my biggest influence, and the reason is because I think he comes at it from two sides. There's the compositional side and what he's doing with the camera, with not minimalism, but creating images where you have a personality and a minimal style of, maybe it's a tabletop still life, or maybe it's a seascape or something like that, that brings your attention in and brings personality out of what he's shooting. And that's the first thing I always loved about his work. The second thing is his craftsmanship as a printer is extremely inspirational. He has an enormous range to what he does. He works really in any medium. I'll tell you an interesting story about Baril. About 12 years ago, I was hell-bent on starting a photography magazine. I wanted to do a print publication. I was trying to do this myself. I was doing freelance design work and photography stuff on the side, and this was my passion that I wanted to do. Now, this is way before YouTube and all that, and of course this is what I'm doing today. Word to the wise, don't try to start a print publication in the 21st century. You will drive yourself mad. But anyway, what I was preparing is I wanted to have an initial prototype issue of this magazine to work with that I could use to try to get advertising interest and things like that. And so I went ahead and did a couple interviews, and I contacted Tom Baril, and I asked him if I could do an interview with him over the phone. to type up for print, and he obliged. And I mean, I was so nervous on the phone call because this is one of my heroes that I'm talking to, and we were talking about the range of stuff that he does. And you know, as I mentioned, in the 90s he was doing a lot of collodion work and a lot of these alternative process things. And I said, you know, you're doing location work in collodion, which we really didn't look at today. We could do that another time. But he had done these images of the Bethlehem steel mill, and they were just gorgeous, and you know, these just beautiful wet plate process images. And I said, well, how are you doing these? Because you have to develop those negatives in the field. You can't let them dry. And he said, oh, well, I have a horse trailer that has a 100-gallon water tank in the top and has red windows. And it was amazing. I mean, he's definitely a modern day Roger Fenton. And it's also interesting too, because at that time I asked him what he was going to be working on in the future. And he said he was actually breaking away from a lot of the traditional analog process, and he was trying to work with digital. And a lot of it was frustration of the materials that were available at that time. And so that's kind of some of the work he's doing now, which is a lot different, similar in style, but much different than what we're seeing with the images I showed you today, and with some of these other things too. But anyway, I think the world of Tom. I will link up to his website and some other resources below if you're interested in more. I'll build a Pinterest board, and I'll put all those links below in the show notes. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it, and as always, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more videos, because we're doing a ton of videos these days, and you'll always be up on the latest and greatest. Hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel. Anyway, once again, guys, this has been another episode of The Art of Photography. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.